All right, welcome, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Jane Irrigation Training Series. I'm Richard Restuccia, Vice President of Water Management Solutions for Jane Irrigation, and today we're going to be talking about what I feel has been a growing industry over the past few years, and it has to do with outdoor growing for hemp and cannabis. And this has become a really important subject, I've found, because a couple reasons. One, if we wanted to find somebody who's been farming soybeans or cotton or corn for the last 50 years or 100 years, we could talk to one person and probably find a family chain of people that pass down information and knowledge of years and years of experience, and really have a good idea in talking to a few people what we needed to do to be successful. We have farm managers to help us out too, advisors. There's a lot of people to help us. Certainly since the Farm Bill, hemp, and then in many states now, cannabis has become legal in states. And all of a sudden we have a lot of people getting into the business because they see a big opportunity. It's a growing business, but they're not sure how to do it. And this does not come without business risk, right? We see a lot of people try this and not be as successful as they'd want to be. And expense of just time and energy and effort is tremendous. So today we have Michael Derewenko, who is going to be helping us through some questions to ask before you get started, because once again, planning always becomes so important. And I feel lucky that we have Michael to join us today for a couple of reasons. Michael's our marketing manager at Jane, but more importantly for this subject, he's really worked very extensively with some indoor and outdoor growers across the US. And over the past couple of years has really built up a lot of experience and knowledge in the subject area. So I know that a lot of people around the country, when they have a technical question or just want to bounce some ideas off of somebody, they're calling Michael. And as that's happening, he's building more knowledge base as well. And he's really well connected in this space. So Michael, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Michael, I was thinking about this today, and we saw a lot of people getting in this business a couple years ago, and I know you've been out and about, in particular, the last month, calling on a lot of and working with a lot of growers. Are more people getting in the business now, or have we kind of plateaued? Are people getting out? What do you see?
So I think, like a lot of markets, and as we were talking before we started, I'm fortunate enough to kind of visit with a lot of growers and contractors across, different markets, from landscape to ag, into hemp and cannabis. And what I think happens is, mostly in the spring, it's pretty consistent. There's a lot of refinement to existing systems, and existing crops, and they're coming out of the winter in most of the country, so they're doing spring blowouts. And they're getting everything up and running. So I think there is a lot of people getting back into it after the winter. Do I think it's more people than there was winter of last year? I would say yes. The prior winter, probably not so much. And so I think there was a little bit of a pyramid that went up, 2 years ago. And I think it's starting to increase again now. So as I visit sites, it's a lot of, additions and, second, third phases of existing projects, more so than brand new projects, because I think, unless it's in a new state where it's recently become legal, and a lot of the existing states, of the 18 to 25, where it's already existed, recreationally and medicinally, it's a lot of refinement. So I'm going out and it's like, hey, we've been doing it probably the wrong way for a long time, and draining resources. What can we do to make the system better and more efficient? What do you have? And my first question to them is, are you profiting from this yet? Or is this something that you've just, been dumping money into for a year and a half, and you're looking to make your first dollar? And so all that kind of comes into the conversation. But overall, I do see it increasing. I know the demand since COVID started is incredibly high. So there's no short of demand. But a lot of people were selling product that they had inventoried because they were producing it so quickly before COVID. And so I think, by June or July, everybody had kind of sold through what they had, and it was really difficult to find labor to harvest and grow. And so they were a little overwhelmed, and then now it's kind of catching back up where they can have someone like me come out and consult and work with them on the refinement process.
Yeah, interesting. It's so attractive, right? When in particular in hemp, the past few years we've been hearing, 80,000 an acre, 110,000 an acre. I've even thought, gee, how much hemp can I grow in, my garden? Why am I growing flowers? Right? So it's tempting to get into it, and it's been interesting to see the spike in people, then kind of some of the washout, and then how much does pricing and supply have to do with this?
Yeah, so I mean, delay on, from a irrigation manufacturer's standpoint, obviously, we're constantly trying to bring in resources from overseas. We have a reliance on the resin market, just like the oil market. And even beyond our industry, the tractors and the different labor pools they all see increases in price. In some markets, they don't run in parallel. And so just because you're putting more expense into your resources doesn't mean you can charge more for your finished product. And so what that does is that kind of whittles away the market share sometimes, and forces people to evolve and potentially look for new permitting and new licensing that may bring in new income streams. And we'll talk about some of those today.
Yeah, it's interesting what you just said. I hadn't really thought about that, but this could be the reason why we hear so many people saying, I've never been busier, but I'm not making as much money as I used to.
Right. I mean, they've got six guys doing a job that requires 10 people. Over the last, a lot of technology and innovation as we've tried to introduce to the market, has come into play where hopefully we've added efficiencies. Well, in adding efficiencies now, when you're hiring someone, you're not hiring them to simply clip plants anymore. You might be hiring them to water manage. The industry still needs to evolve from a training perspective, and that's where we hope to provide the resources we can.
Yeah. So I just want to remind everybody, I've got both the chat and the Q&A open. So if you have some questions today as we're talking, put them into the chat and the Q&A, and I'll watch those and pass them on to Michael when it's appropriate. And Michael, the other question I had for you is what was kind of your motivation for this presentation? Why did you decide this would be a good one?
The main reason is, just like we did this for landscape a few weeks ago, you learn a lot when you first go onto a site. First impressions are very key, and knowing know the questions and the answers you get from contractors and from growers right off the bat teach you a lot about kind of the operation and maybe some of the challenges they're facing. Email and phone are great, but the majority of times, if you don't know the right questions to ask, it just creates more questions for me. And so by visiting these sites, there's it's pretty obvious what everybody should be looking at, but it's not obvious to them because they're out there digging the ditches in the sun every day, or doing the work. And sometimes it takes a third party perspective to help them focus. And I just thought that this would be a very 10,000 foot view of when I go on a site. Here's some simple things I look at to add efficiencies to an operation that maybe they're overlooking because they're so consumed in the day to day logistics of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, great point. So, well, let's take us through the topics to cover.
Yeah, so we're going to cover 5 or 6 different topics today. I'll preface it by saying, as an irrigation manufacturer, not an attorney. Ooh, it looks like it's glitching a little. Hold on.
You're still good. You're there.
Okay, good. All right. So a couple things that we look at, when I walk on a site, I really want to see, the soil is everything. When we're growing larger, in the larger facilities, very rarely are they going to use pots. They might use wireframe, burlap sacks to grow stuff in. But ultimately, we're going to look at the soil because hopefully it's a big enough operation to turn profit that they're going to be putting the root base into soil. So we want to review just simply how water moves through different soil types, how you become, what kind of soil do you have, easy ways to get it testing, and, how to displace some of that cost. And then ultimately to deal with, little rodents that are digging around your plants that find the hemp and the cannabis roots very sweet, as they do the tubing and the resin. And in the dry months, they look for water. So simple ways to keep that out, and maybe, maximize your growth. Setting up perimeters and fencing. I can't tell you how many times I see fence poles go through irrigation lines. So we want to kind of make sure that people think about that, the order in which you install fencing and perimeters, which is by law necessary. Permitting and licensing. I have some simple notes on that. Obviously, anybody that's getting into this knows that the government needs their money, and the way that they do this is through permitting and licensing. And it's effectively different in every county, state, and region. And so, we want to point some things out that we see here in California that are comparable to what they'll see in their given areas. Pumps and tanks. This is our specialty when it comes to water and hydraulics. We want to make sure that they're centralizing certain aspects and components of their system to make things easier, more efficient, and then obviously easier to maintenance to reduce costs and labor. Rocks and boulders. California the Southwest has way more probably than most places. I know in Florida we dealt with sand a lot. Out here we deal with rocks and boulders. It doesn't seem like a big deal until you start digging and then realize you have bedrock 2 feet down. So it can be an issue. So we'll address some of those things. Same with tree stumps and native landscaping. You want to be careful not to destroy any, protected manzanita out here, or anything from a national forest or national wildlife and conservation, that they're not going to come out and red flag you, because that's a big deal if they come out there and they see piles of, manzanita or a protected tree. And then lastly, dust control. This is one that's overlooked, but hemp plants and cannabis plants do not like layers of dust on them. I've been yelled at many times for driving 5 miles an hour through a property, because it does cast up dust certain times a year, and that dust sits on leaves, and it can be detrimental to pests and to mites.
Well, this is great information. I can't wait to hear more about it.
Cool. All right, well, we'll start with rodents. So rodents, like I mentioned, a lot of the facilities I see, you have anything from deer to rabbit to gophers to moles to even birds. In the dry months, they're looking for water. And the resin, a lot of the times, it internally has a sweetness to it, and it has water on it, and so they're going to tear through it. They're going to chew on it. And they're going to create breaks in your lines. You're going to end up spending a lot of money on couplings to replace these, especially the tape. They love digging through them. And then ultimately they're going to go after your root base. They want that moisture that's in the root base. And so this is one of the main reasons people grow hemp and cannabis or any crop above ground, and they'll put them in 125-gallon mesh burlap sacks, and grow it above ground. It also makes mobility easier. If you have to move trees around for anything from maintenance to fire protection to any kind of permitting red flags that you may get, moving plants around is a big deal. Typically, cannabis and hemp plants, you're not growing them bigger than 6-7 feet, like a small Christmas tree. So you really don't need them. You need them to be so big that you can't mobilize them. And so sometimes they'll plant them on top of the ground. It also allows you to control your soils better. You're not reliant on the soil that's in the ground, although this can be complicated sometimes with larger grow areas. And so you become at the mercy of your local gophers and moles. And there's many ways to trap these, and many distributors sell mole and gopher traps, some more humane than others. But pests can be truly pests. And I put a definition in the bottom right corner that outlines exactly how the California government sees pests, and they are aware of them. So if they come out and they see gopher holes, they're going to want you to take care of that, because they don't want pests or anything that can carry bacteria or a disease tearing up your stuff. You're tearing up your crop that's going to ultimately be ingested. So they're looking out for your safety as well.
So I had a question here that came in, and so it's an annual crop, cannabis and hemp, both, right? And so if you're growing them in pots over the ground, how do you irrigate that?
Yeah, so very similar to vineyards, we drape, our emitter line, and we use what are called like vine curls or vine hooks that hold it above the surface. Hydraulically, it can create some challenges, which is why a lot of people like putting the plant in the ground. Even if you put it in a burlap sack to contain the root system and control the soil types, you can still put it in the ground. So you dig a hole and you plant the burlap in the hole. Because what they're getting at is you have to drape hose from one to the other, and now all of a sudden you have it sitting above the ground. So I've seen like a kind of a trellis style system, or like a wine grape system, where it's going to hold it right above the surface, because a lot of times the 125-gallon pots are going to keep the bottom of the root base 2.5 feet off the ground, and so you need something to stabilize the lines once they're full of water. A lot of times they'll use tree rings. It distributes water a little more consistently around the bottom of the root base, and then the weight of the water is almost like a Christmas tree stand where it holds it around it better. And then you can come up off the ground with a series of fittings. Obviously, that's a little more expensive. And then it makes it impossible to use tape because when tape doesn't have water in it, it gets very kind of flimsy in between and creates these ebbs and flows, which you don't want. And so I would say the best way to do it is have some form of infrastructure with just like galvanized wire where it runs, even with the grade of the bottom of the tree, and then the vine clips hold the emitter line next to it. So it's at the same level as the root base.
Yeah. Oh, very, very interesting. Yeah, I can see how that would work, and more importantly, help you with rodent control too, or at least
Yeah.
the damage that the rodents can cause to the irrigation.
Yeah, I mean, what happens is a lot of times if you're in a rainy area or even once the water if you're watering perfectly, you don't have a lot of runoff, but that's very hard to do, especially with grade changes. And so as that water runs off the bottom of the plant, you will get weeds, and this is where maintenance comes into effect. You don't want a bunch of weeds because as soon as weeds start to grow around your crop and you weed whack them, the seeds spread and it just becomes like a wildfire. And you also don't want to spray chemicals around the base of your plant either. So, you want to try to execute getting water and point source emission next to the base of the plant the best you can, so you don't have all this additional maintenance. And so, if you're using an emitter line with custom spacing, spaced every 6 feet where your plants are, that's the best scenario. That way, you don't have all this wasted water in between. It's the same reason in vineyards that we elevate our emitter line off the ground is so we can weed whack around the bottom to try to reduce weeds that are just going to suck up the moisture that you're trying to deliver to your plants. And so a little bit has to do with the health and the thriving of the plant, and a little bit of it has to do with reducing maintenance and labor for the grower.
So what soil type should we be looking for, and especially if we can put them in our own pots, right? We're in control of the soil then and the nutrients much more easily. What should we be looking for?
So the soil market's a huge industry now, especially for hemp and cannabis. You have companies like Fox Farm and these other major growers that are willing, or major manufacturers that are willing to make the soil and the compost teas that you need. So you can buy it already done, depending on where you're at, depending what the kind of climate you're seeing. So from an artificial standpoint, it's relatively endless to the resources that you can buy from your local hydroponics retailer. And then it also has to do with whether or not you're growing hemp, cannabis, when you're yielding the plant. Are you waiting for it to come to complete fruition where you're, clipping the buds off of it to make into an extract of high potency? So you're going to want, a more probably expensive soil type or something with more precision to it. Whereas if you're growing a hemp plant and you're growing 50,000 plants, you may not be beyond the reliance of what exists there in nature. And then it's going to come down to more than tilling and reducing your boulders and your rocks to make sure that the water, moves through it properly. And you're not getting these plants sitting in water, with bedrock 3 feet down. So not necessarily the type of soil, because a lot of times you're going to be at the mercy of what you've got. You can mix some nutrients in there. A lot of the nutrients are going to be delivered through your irrigation lines. So you hope the soil over time becomes a little bit more malleable. But then the one big thing is you're not going to grow hemp or cannabis after somebody's been growing bamboo or corn in a field for the last 20, 30 years. So a lot of the facilities I visit are newly developed agricultural property. It's very much like when we go to Fresno for some of our filming productions. You can plant certain trees after other trees, but not other trees, because they've literally sucked the nutrients out of the ground. And so it's up to the grower to try to introduce the right nutrients to get the new plants to thrive. And that's done with soil testing. I mean, you take your soil test into a local distributor, usually where you're buying these soils or where you're buying the irrigation products. They're going to test the soil for you. You're going to look at your numbers. You're going to see how acidic the oil is, or the soil is. It's going to tell you what kind of acids you need to either introduce or work against, in your soil types to get your pH where you want it. And you're going to focus on things like that. So there's plenty of resources to get you where you need to go. And then as far as looking up the numbers to the ideal, you want to look at where you're at regionally. It also never hurts to ask a friend who's growing it in the area, what kind of successes they've had too.
Yeah, great point. And then what about, the density? Do we like sandy soil, a clay soil? What should we be looking for?
So structurally, you want if you're in a windy area, which a lot of places are because they're on the sides of hills or in valleys. If you're in a windy area, you still need the tree to be able to stand up on its own. You don't want to have to do any kind of staking ideally. So you want the soil to be compressed enough that the root base can grow outwards, and, create a stable situation for it not to blow over. Yet you also want it, permeable enough that the water is going to move through it and it's not going to sit in water. And, in California, we have, or even in the East Coast, you have this caliche clay, or out here you have bedrock, or you have, some very solid soils that just hold on to that water. Hemp and cannabis, that's how it can lead to extreme issues when the soil base is just sitting in water. So you really want to make sure that the water moves through it successfully. You're not having to water daily. And this can be done with a simple jar test of soil and dropping some water in it to see how fast it moves through it and timing it. And it'll give you some idea of the flow rate you want to use in your emission devices. So you want to find a happy medium. Everywhere is going to be different. But anybody brings us testing results, it makes it a lot easier for us to try to troubleshoot, as opposed to just saying, hey, this is ideally what you're looking for, because it's never true in the real world.
Right. Is hemp and cannabis, is it a thirsty crop?
Yeah, it's pretty thirsty. I mean, the main reason it's really thirsty is because we're trying to grow it as fast as possible. I mean, especially in northern parts of the country where, we said it's an annual crop, but they're trying to turn and burn a couple times a year, and so you're trying to get it to grow as fast as possible. You don't have a year to wait to yield a lot of times, and so that's why we use hoop houses and different things to kind of concentrate the UV and protect them from any pests or any cold weather that might come, that might slow down or stifle the growing process. And so a lot of the reason we're watering it so much is to introduce nutrients in it to expedite the growth and the yields, to maximize and profit. And so that's what we're doing, as opposed to like turf, where we're trying to water bare minimum just to keep it alive and green. So it is a crop we're trying to move water through pretty quickly.
Right. A couple different goals there.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so, I don't sell fencing, so I don't have a huge amount of knowledge of fencing. I will tell you, I've seen every different kind, from simple 3-strand barbed wire, to keep, cattle and goats out, and local horses, to just kind of set up a perimeter so people know not to go there. We talked briefly this week with some growers, and a lot of places like in the Pacific Northwest, in California, it's kind of true as well. What the government really wants to make sure, the local agencies want to make sure of, is that, schools and libraries and some public places aren't smelling it or seeing cannabis and hemp, because it has quite a strong pungent scent throughout the years. And, there is still a little bit of a stigma. I think it's a conversation some parents aren't ready to have with some kids, and so they don't want to really have to discuss it. So I think the general consensus is, if you can't see it and you can't smell it and you're paying your bills, we really don't care that you're doing it, in so many words. That's my diplomatic response. They also, when it comes to wind shear and when it comes to dust control, some of the fencing, you're going to want to put some sort of a liner in there to protect these crops. And then also you have security issues all over the country. You see these no trespassing signs for hemp because, you've got people jumping in there trying to cut stalks of it off, thinking that there's something to be done with it, but there's just not. You would just need so much of it to do anything exciting with it. It's just not going to happen. Am I
Right.
still going? Sorry, I have some
Yeah.
pauses here. Okay. So sometimes barbed wire is overkill. Once again, here's the premises definition from California Department of Food and Agriculture. They basically just want, your surrounding neighbors and your surrounding landowners to know where your perimeter starts and ends, very similar to other crops or just boundaries in general. But like I said, in some parts of the country where it's flatter, and you can see further, there's not as many grade changes. The expectation is going to be that, no one knows what you're doing back there, and that you're far enough away, that those conversations don't need to exist.
It's interesting though, because that's not an inexpensive fence we're looking at here.
No, it's not. And I think the screen grab, I mean, there's probably livestock or something on the other side. Usually, once again, and this is a point that I didn't really touch on in my slides, but we talk about this all the time. The value of of a hemp or a cannabis tree is very expensive. It's more than a Christmas tree, and it's definitely more than like a native cactus or something we're growing. Anything in the landscape industry that I can think of, for the height and the size and the footprint it takes up doesn't make you $5,000 or $6,000 potentially, every 6 or 7 months. And so the value of the plant justifies, the value of the perimeter that you're putting up to protect it. Just like bigger houses have bigger walls, a more expensive plant, it requires, better fencing and better protection. Very rarely do we see cameras and, internal, systems of surveillance used on small grows. They're usually larger grows. And something like a fence like this is probably used on what we'll see here in a second is 5,000 plant minimum, where the cost is justified.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, right? We saw pecan prices so high that they had armed security guards in those orchards at night because they weren't fenced off and secure, and people were coming in and stealing. So yeah, you could imagine this when anything gets that valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen safes the size of my house, protecting extracts and whatnot. And so yeah, security doesn't just extend to the perimeter, it extends internally as well. Nutrients are very expensive. Just the sun, it can destroy different nutrients that labor's gone into and different resources have gone into. So I think across the board, the value of all these different resources need to be protected. And I think the smaller growers that evolve into larger growers realize that, and they realize that these are justified expenses because as soon as you have, a 2,500 gallon tank of water filled with nutrients, and then the hours that went into mixing it, spring a leak or getting destroyed by bacteria or algae because it wasn't protected with a canopy overhead. Those are problems that we hope that people think about in advance, where they're not thinking about it after the fact. And this is a perfect example of that. Yeah, you don't think you need a fence because nobody knows what you're doing back there. Very quickly, you find out that you do, and you thought about it too late. And not to mention, there's also some cross pollination of problems. I mean, when I walk into an indoor facility, I've got to put booties on, I've got to put a face mask on.
Mhm.
You've got to pull it like pretty much full, nurses scrubs on to go in there because they don't want you moving mites and other pests from one place to another. And so that's things that they're looking out for, and the government definitely wants you to look out for those as well, because people will ultimately be ingesting these things. So.
Yeah, fascinating. New problems, new challenges, I should say, with new crops.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about outdoor here, which is fencing, but everywhere uses code panels and, 2 or 3 way steps to get into a facility. Usually the facilities, the grow and the clipping facilities are in the back of the property, so everything can be vetted before they get there. Which is why we're going to talk about dust control. It's because usually you have to drive to the back of the property to see where everything's at that we're consulting on. So you're driving past the crop first. And so, yeah, these are things to think about. As I mentioned, I'm not a specialist when it comes to the legal aspects of it. In California, these are some simple prices I've brought up, for permitting and licensing. And so this kind of tells you some of the money that has to go into just the licensing and process. Not only do you have to check all the boxes to get the permit, but you also have to dish out some money and some fees to do it. So you want to look at these as line items along with all the resources and labor you're going to be putting into a grow operation, to make sure that it justifies the expense and your ROI is not extended too far where, it's draining you dry.
So they really are pricing these or using a pricing model over the size of your operation, right? If you're small, medium, or large, it's going to be a different price.
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately comes, it's very similar to any tax. The more you bring in, the more you're gonna have to pay out. And they're very well aware of the value of this crop. So these prices are reflective of your profits that you should be making. I've visited some facilities where they say that these licensing fees are ridiculous, and I've visited other ones where they're not a problem. It's a blip in the radar because they're so efficient and profitable. And so I think, I think some of it is a little aggressive on some of the smaller stuff. Some of these middle and light tier permits for $3,000. A lot of these fees are annual. A lot of them are even quarterly. Some of them are even monthly in some states where it's newer. They want to make sure that if you're in operation, you're able to foot the bill every month. This doesn't even include water rights. Depending on where you're pulling your water from, you have to prove that if you're pulling your water from a utility, you have to pay for that as well. So there's definitely additional fees and permitting required for a lot of this stuff. But more than anything, they just really want to make sure, you're providing a quality product to the consumer. And some states, have heavier legislation because they've had more time to think about it. Some, like California, have been very progressive, where we've moved really quickly on it. And so I think there's a lot of addendums to the permitting and licensing process that are coming up. And even some of those are more aggressive because they're finding that these counties can charge more to capitalize on it, which is kind of a shame, but obviously we've seen it happen in agriculture for years.
I think it's such a great point, Michael, that it's not static. It's always moving, and the agencies, the government agencies, are still learning as well. And so, if you're going to be in this business, you better be flexible.
And patient, yeah, and patient. The Ohio Wellness Facility that we spotlighted, a couple years ago. I mean, I think their process was 2.5 years. Anything from firewalls inside having to be moved to, reflective coating and shielding on the inside to perimeter fencing. All these things. You want to give yourself plenty of time to do this, and it's one of the more patient crops to grow, because there's such a learning curve with the permitting offices and agencies where, a lot of them are coming out and trying to figure it out as they go. And then, like I said, to capitalize on what you're doing. And then every year goes by, they figure out a little more that they can squeeze out of it. And that's why you've got to be, you got to be on the ball with your efficiencies to make sure that you're making profit as fast as they're willing to take some of it away from you.
Yeah, great points. Really good points.
Yeah. And then I made a note here. This was something that I had never really thought about, but the seed process. A lot of a lot of the cannabis guys, they're not trying to make seeds unless they usually keep their seeds internally because they put a lot of time into the cloning process. So they're going to take their seeds and they're going to grow more of their plant to produce the product that they want, and not share it with others. And then there's manufacturers out there that's all they do is their seed banks where they just grow plants, take the seeds off of them, and they sell the seeds. Well, you need a permit for that as well. So that's just one. You have wholesale permitting to grow larger amounts of hemp and cannabis and sell it. You have processing permitting and licensing, and you have not only growing, but you have, if you're going to grow seeds and you plan to distribute those or sell those for a profit, you're going to have to pay fees on top of that.
Wow, that's complicated. That's a lot of stuff. Time to roll up your sleeves and do your homework before you get started.
Yeah, I think that's why when the facilities I see, they usually specialize in one thing. They're either like Ohio, like we were saying, for instance, they were one of only, I think, 12 permit holders at the time, and they were using two or three different licenses where they had the license to grow it, the license to wholesale it, and then the license to extract it. So they were actually taking and compressing it, making it into these very strong, potent oils for cancer patients. And so that's why their process took so much longer, is because they now had, three levels of government oversight to adhere to make sure that they were checking all their boxes. But after 2.5 years, every 3 or 4 months, you're pulling in maximum yield and maximum profits. And now it just comes down to protecting it and paying back those debts that you've incurred over the last 2.5 years. And so a lot of the places I visit, they're just straight up, like the photo here is up in Oregon. They're specifically growing this hemp to manufacture into like edibles, like gummy bears and brownies and cookies and stuff like this for medicinal and recreational use. So they have kind of their scope is as tight as possible, so they can perfect their craft.
Yeah, so I've seen this photo before, and I think you mentioned to me once that people say, "Gee, the plants don't look that healthy in that photo." Why don't they?
Well, so right before you yield them, this particular instance, you can't really see, but in the kind of the further away, they've already started cutting all the buds off of these. And so the last few weeks, you cut off water, you cut off nutrients to them to let them kind of dry out on the plant a little. Well, I know I'm going to get there naysayers that say that that's not the best way to do it. Some prefer just to cut it at the bottom and hang it. These particular growers had their had a certain way that they did their operation, and that was to kind of let the buds dry on the plant. And so they cut off water, and in doing so, the leaves around it get very dried out and kind of crumbly like that. And it doesn't look like the most, majestic looking hemp plant. But this is just a process they use. These hemp plants in particular have, also I've had the comment that they have giant buds on them that most hemp plants don't have on them. And so none of the buds on here are going to produce a THC that's potent enough to maybe categorize as cannabis. But that's the process they use. And that's why kind of doing a webinar like this is very difficult. As we've talked, there's a lot of ins and outs. There's a lot of regional differences. Every grower kind of has their little ways of doing things differently. Not only do they have ways of doing it different, but they do it differently every season. I mean, I'll go to a crop one year and then the next year they're doing a completely different procedure to maybe dry stuff out or to harvest it or to water it, introduce nutrients to it. And so it's constantly changing, evolving. And so, in the resources we provide, we have to evolve alongside of them. And that's why, I like doing things like this, because visiting them all, I mean, if anybody has any questions, we've seen it all. It's just hard to get into a 30-minute webinar, but that's kind of the justification for the state of those plants in particular.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Great explanation. And then I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that because it's actually a fabulous photo, but
yeah, this one, if you look at the bottom, they have the plastic mulch, as they call it, which they put around the ground. That was actually for rodent control. So the tape that we had, they were using our chape and tape at the base of these plants, and they had a coupling about every 10 feet. And I was like, what's up with all these couplings? Why don't you just replace the line? And they're like, oh, every day we come out here and there's holes in it because the gophers and the squirrels come digging into it to look for water, to make their nests, and because they're thirsty. And so this was one where we had extreme pest issues that they had to overcome, and also some dust control issues.
yeah, so many challenges. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, knowing the right products to use to solve these things. The next year they put the tape below the plastic mulch and it solved a lot of their problems, And so it's little things. There's some evolution there. So this is so where do I install my pumps and my tanks? We have I have a million photos of pumps and tanks that I could have put on here. The reason I put these on is these are kind of fresh in my mind. This is a smaller facility I just visited. I think they're anywhere between 5 and 10,000 plants, like 7,500 plants. This has been harvested for hemp for about the last 2 years. It's in southeastern California. As you can see, it's very much desert Southwest, although they did have a foot of snow last year. So that's it's a very difficult climate to try to grow something in when you're at 4,000 feet and you get snow part of the year, and then it gets very hot, 90 to 95 degrees, if not 100 degrees, Death Valley's, right around the corner. So what I do when I visit a site is, coming from Florida, we were pulling water out of reservoirs constantly. So I learned a lot about pumps, a lot about air tanks and whatnot. I like to take photos of the air tank. So I will tell any grower out there, if you need any hydraulic support from me, take a picture of your air tanks, take a picture of, your pump start relays, your pump. If you're using a centrifugal here, they're using it's a 6-inch casing on a jet pump. That's what that on the left side is going into the ground. And what a jet pump is, if you don't know, it's forcing water down to basically force water up. It's a better cooling system for a pump. It sits in water. So in a hot situation like this, it's not going to allow for overheating, where a centrifugal pump that sits on top of the ground runs parallel with the earth, or horizontal with the grade. And sometimes you can get more friction in heating it. And if it's something that's having to click on and off all the time to fill a big tank like you see in the middle, that's why you want to use like a jet pump that's in the ground. Like I said, everybody's different. We have pump guys out there that will argue their centrifugal pump is oil cooled or water cooled, and that doesn't happen. But general principle is where there's friction, there's heat. Where there's heat, you have seals that light up, and then you end up displacing some of that cost in air tanks or fill tanks to make sure that the pumps aren't running as much as possible. So obviously, we want our air tanks to be next to our pump. What these tanks do is they fill with water. There's a bladder in there a lot of the times, and as the tanks pull the water out, the bladder kind of helps push the water out, and then it fills back up. This is where we'll take our pressure readings. This is where we take our pump readings, so we know how much water is coming out of our pumps. This is where we get our gallons per minute and our flow, our pressure, different things like this. This is definitely a smaller system. And so these tanks get huge, and then they get smaller, and sometimes they're even buried in the ground because they get so hot that they heat the water, up to almost to a boiling to a boiling point, which is bad. And then also in this case is these tanks sit kind of lower in the ground, so you're not trying to drill through bedrock. So they sit on the lower part of the property, and then we're pumping water uphill, as you can see in the far right photo. So the water's coming up a hill and it's going into a tank. Well, when I rolled up to this property is about 60 acres. They had a tank at the bottom, they had a tank in the middle, they had a tank at the top. So their pressure readings were all over the place. And those formulas at the bottom are not very complex. You have your static variables, which are your constants, the 0.43, which is essentially for every foot of head, you're gaining 0.43 pounds of pressure. You put in how high above your tanks are or your pump is above where you're trying to move water to, and you get your pounds of pressure. So it's very simple. Just like you throw water up in the air, water comes down. And that's what they learned here is so we centralized all their tanks to the middle of the property. That way we're pumping water to the middle of the property. We're storing the water. The pump sits in idle and it cools itself off. And then it doesn't have to come on until it has to fill the tanks again. And the system and the sprinkler isn't reliant on the pump clicking on and off when the water window is trying to irrigate. The water's there. The supply is there. It's in the tanks and it's pulling from it whenever they need it. So the pump is being used very sparingly. Maybe once a week, they're filling up 3 2,500-gallon tanks. I think this pump in particular pulls, 10 to 20 gallons per minute. And so they're running it for about a day to fill up 2 or 3 tanks. And then they'll either mix in these tanks their nutrients, or we use like our Maisie venturi suction fertigation systems where it utilizes the pressure coming out of these tanks. There's about to be a separate pump there on the secondary side to keep water and pressure going to the irrigation valves constant. That's where we'll introduce our nutrients. And then ultimately they will be building a pavilion above all of this to not only protect the water and the nutrients, but to protect the guys that are mixing it so they're not getting burned up in the summer out there.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I hadn't thought about how efficient the gravity fed system would be in this situation, right? Pump it to the tank, let gravity displace it to your field, and you'll save a ton of energy that way.
Yeah, I mean, where we're at, these hills, you dig down 3 feet, it's bedrock. And so you have to go to the bottom of the hills to find anywhere you can even put a well in.
Mm.
This well is about 125 feet down to find water. Well, the top of the hill is 350 feet uphill. So you're not, I mean, just rationale is not going to have you drilling a well at the top of the hill. If that was the case, then this would be a very short webinar because we'd be moving water downhill all the time. And that very rarely happens. Typically what happens, our resources at the bottom, we need to get it to the top and then we need to move it, throughout the property, which is anywhere from the top to the middle to the bottom. And so in this case, the best decision was to centralize the tanks in the middle of the hill, move water up there when we needed to. And then that way our secondary pump is only working as hard as it needs to move water an additional 125 feet up the grade of the hill. And then we're using, regulators and pressure compensating point source emitters, an emitter line. So everything's constant on the secondary side as well, which makes us, monitor our nutrients and our water that much easier.
Yeah, really cool. I like this.
Some things that, should be in our purview that aren't really something I deal with on a professional level every day. But one thing I do see is like this site in particular, when I rolled up, this is outside of Warner Springs, Southern California. This site did not look that flat and nice the first time I went there. There was a lot of excavating that was done. Behind me is a pile of boulders ranging from golf ball size up to the size of a truck that they had to move. A lot of times this is done by professionals just because of the liability involved. The last thing you want is somebody from the government coming out there and seeing a 16-year-old, driving a backhoe, moving giant boulders where they could get flipped over. And so, give me a second.
Yeah, what an interesting machine here. I've not seen one of those before.
Yeah, so this is doing a combination of 2 things. This is it's introducing water into the line for dust control. It's doing some excavating, and then it's also displacing boulders off to the side. And so it's kind of a combination of machinery where you're pulling the boulders up while you're digging your ditches, and you're also you have another guy in a backhoe that's moving the boulders off to the side. And rocks and boulders can be used for many things, not only perimeters, but they can be used to go under roads as filler. So a lot of growers are trying to use everything they can. You're not shipping boulders off somewhere else and you also don't want to corner your property, turning into like the Flintstones town over here. You've got to use them. And so a lot of the guys, what they'll do is they use them for perimeters. They use them for, infrastructure on the buildings that they may need, or they put them under their roads. That way, when it does rain, the water makes its way through the road system. In general, Roman philosophy.
Yeah. It's a
And I,
great idea. And
please.
what an efficient machine this is to be able to do all those things at one time.
And this comes down to a lot of these things. It's like hire a professional to do it. The time you're going to spend, I understand some backhoes are 3 levers and you can rent them by the day and you think you're saving money by doing it. But I can't tell you how many times I've gone out there and they've been sitting on a backhoe rental for 6 months when it was supposed to be a 2-month job, because they came across things in the ground they weren't expecting. A lot of these bigger companies are going to go in there with some form of sonar where they're going to look for these boulders, and that's how they're going to, resource out the machines that are going to go there that day. So they're upfront. So the general expense covers all that upfront, looking into it and figuring out what's in there, as more of a discovery aspect, as opposed to you being out there and very quickly finding out you have giant boulders that the backhoe you've rented can't move them. And that's why I put the weights here. That used to happen to me all the time. Excuse me, all the time. You rent a piece of machinery based on the size of the mysteries you're going to come up on. Well, you can see how quickly in tonnage some of these boulders get. And so when you're starting to move, a 5 foot by 5 foot boulder, which doesn't really seem that big, that weighs 6.25 tons, that's a huge boulder. That requires a very big piece of machinery and ultimately somebody that knows how to use it, because usually you're not just rolling it 5 feet away. You're usually having to move it somewhere. And now you're moving something that, weighs 6 tons. What's a truck? 3, 4 tons. So it weighs more than a vehicle and you're having to move it hundreds of yards. The liability there is very high. Hire a professional if you can. If not, get some feedback from a professional before you take it on yourself.
Yeah. You and a buddy aren't going to be able to move that.
No, and if you can never tell if it's there or not. And once again, you usually ask your neighbors, hey, when you dug your around here to build your house, build your facility, was there a bunch of rocks? And they'll tell you. This is one of the first questions I ask along with soil type. How's your soil out here? Hey, is there a lot of rocks? And they'll usually say, yeah, there's some, but they work to our advantage because they'll dig them up, plant their plants, and then they'll put them around the top, just to kind of create some weight to help move the water through the root base efficiently. So you can use them to your advantage as well. And then also, one of the things is, like I said, if it's not an existing agricultural site and you're trying to grow plants, like hemp and cannabis that are very, very valuable, you want to make sure the root systems from anything that grew there before you started to grow has been removed. Cutting something at the root base and then digging around it is just not an option. You've got to fully excavate plants and trees to get everything back to how you want it. So it's a controlled circumstance. All your variables are under control, so you can plant the plants you want, and you don't have to worry about it halfway into where your roots hit 24 inches and then they start to hit something that's detrimental to their life. And and cost you some money. And so once again, hiring a professional to do this always works. I found 3 or 4 documents for California alone on over 1,200 different protected plants and trees. Once again, there's nothing worse than someone from the county coming out there and seeing a pile of protected trees and plants. And this is something that you're going to have to deal with. And then this site that I visited this week, they're leaving a lot of the natural stuff in. They like it. It creates kind of dust control. It's not. It doesn't create this cropping system, the lineage where you get these rows. They kind of like that guerrilla style growing, as they call it. It drives my OCD crazy because I'm having to look through and my counts are off and the emitter line's kind of snaking through stuff, which isn't something that I like. But a lot of growers prefer that way, especially if you're going on the side of the hill. Sometimes you need that stable root base to hold your soil up there. And so, or you get heavy rains, or in their case, snow, and it protects from different temperature extremes. So sometimes, a lot of the facilities aren't like you'd think they are. They're just grown amongst the pines and grown amongst the manzanita on purpose, and they leave them there. And a lot of times it's also because they're protected, and you can't afford to cut them down.
That's really interesting, and I'd love to see one of those sites, the gorilla growing. That sounds beautiful, actually. So, are we always irrigating with emitter line, or are there other ways people are irrigating?
Um, okay, so they're definitely not going to water overhead. We definitely want point source watering. So we want to deliver water right to the root base. The plants, cannabis and hemp plants, definitely like most plants. I know that's an arguable subject, but they don't want water sitting on the leaf surface. Besides the natural rain that's going to come down for some minor dust control, ultimately we're trying to deliver as much water to the root base as possible. Also, it's a delivery method for fertigation and for our nutrients. We don't want that sitting on the leaves. And so we're trying to deliver to the bottom. So we're using emitter line with custom spacing for a lot of our hemp or tape as well, if it's a bigger facility. And then we're using point source emitters with supply tubing. And then recently we've even used some quarter-inch emitter line to create little tree rings to move some water to the root base quicker. So you're not just dribbling water on each side of the tree trunk. You're able to connect a hose where it's going to deliver water in a circular pattern, and that's going to get your root base to grow to the surface and outwards to give it that canopy protection we talked about, so it doesn't get blown over in a windstorm and you don't have to do any additional staking.
Right. So then you would use these impacts for what?
For dust control. So, just like we talked about weed whacking in vineyards, and you're usually having to use a gator or some form of a tractor in between these lines to move stuff around when it comes time to crop or just general maintenance. It kicks up a lot of dust. I mean, as we just said, we're trying to water to the base of the root plant, to the base of the tree or the plant. So there's not a lot of moisture going beyond that plant. And the reason we do that is because we want our nutrients concentrated to where we want them. Well, in doing so, now we have our maintenance and our maintenance roads getting very dusty from all the traffic. And so a lot of times what we'll do is we'll line the roads with impacts. They produce a bigger droplet of water, and that bigger droplet of water is going to help with dust control. That way, when you're driving around the property, you're not kicking up dust, getting it all over your plants, and just breathing it, which isn't healthy at all either.
Well, Michael, this has been really fascinating and really helpful. I really appreciate that. And I know that people are going to have more questions later. Can they get a hold of you? How can they get a hold of you and ask you?
Yeah, so I try to keep my Twitter feed pretty relevant to this industry as I visit these facilities. It's obviously of the utmost important to not let anything proprietary out. I know a lot of growers have kind of their trade secrets that they don't want to share, so I'll never share that. As you can see in some of the photos I show today, it's pretty generic. It's just kind of general principle and practice and how we can solve some of these things. But yeah, you can always email me directly or follow my Twitter feed. Same with our Jane USA Instagram feed. We really try to keep that relevant to the ag landscape and cannabis and hemp industry. We have nothing but support materials on there and stuff that adds value to different sites. We kind of stay away, as we have in the past, to just kind of flutter, things that don't have any true value to them. We really use it as a knowledge database where you can refer to, our 300 posts over the last 5 years of being on Instagram as value added material for your given sites. And, if you have additional, questions, you can hit us up through Instagram or you can email me directly. I spend many days a week just responding and going back and forth with growers to make sure that they feel comfortable using not only the products that we sell, but our competition's products, or whatever resources they have locally. More than anything, we want people to do it right. And if we're a resource for that, that's great. If you can use our products, even better.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. This has been really helpful, and I know people learned a lot, and I know you're very generous with your knowledge and experience. So thank you for that. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. Hope you have a wonderful weekend, and remember that all our trainings are at janesusa.com/trainings. You can see them all there. You can also listen to the podcast. We're on Google, Apple, Spotify, and iHeartRadio podcasts now as well. So you can enjoy those while you're going job to job, or even at times when you're on the job. So anyway, thank you again, and have a nice weekend. We'll see you all next week. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, guys.